going to speak today about the life of charity. And when we say the word charity, usually we think in our minds giving money to something, finding a cause for which we can donate our time, our talent, our treasure, and that's our charity. But of course, the word charity is used in the church to describe a friendship. It's the specific word for love. That means my relationship, not just with God, but also with God's church. In other words, it has to do with the way in which you and I love. When we love anyone, we do so with a certain kind of aha moment. All love, St. Thomas says, is based on a kind of similitude. I find a creature who is like me. Remember that in Genesis, the first thing that expresses joy in the first pages of Genesis has to do, of course, when Adam sees Eve, when the man sees the woman. He never got really excited when he saw the aardvark. Right? He never jumped up and down when the rhino came by to be named, because there wasn't sufficient amounts of similitude. Friendship is based upon likeness. We're like someone else. And that's why you've all experienced before that occasion in which you look at someone and you say, "You too?" That begins it. And whatever that you too is, whatever that common life is, that commonality, is the thing around which the friendship can be based and can grow. But all friends need to know, of course, that the other person wills them good, and that the other person is willing to labor for their good. So, benevolence, meaning I will someone good, which is the essence of all love, has to end in a kind of beneficence, meaning that I'm willing to labor for your good. Is it not true that ultimately the amount that we're willing to suffer for someone is directly proportionate to the amount of love that we have for them? It's easy for me to love someone on the street and walk away and not be very concerned about them. It's very difficult, as you have no doubt noticed, to love the people that are in your family sometimes, or the people that are closest to you. Why? Because it matters with them. And yet, I would more readily suffer for the people, quote unquote, that are in my life than the person that's on the street. So when we have this thing called charity, it's not just my natural love for God. In other words, if a similitude is necessary, if a likeness is necessary to be in friendship with someone, how does it happen with God? The grace that we spoke about in the sacraments is where we receive this friendship. We spoke about baptism. We spoke about the woman touching the tassel. God makes us friends in baptism by giving us his divine grace, by making us like him. Isn't it ironic that in Genesis we were tempted to be like God when that's exactly what we're supposed to be? In other words, how can we be friends with someone that we have no likeness to? As we said earlier, we were meant to be like God. He made us like himself, and he was going to elevate us to be even more like himself. The temptation, though, was to be like God, of course, without God. And now, we are to be like God as man. In other words, when Christ assumes to himself a human nature, he takes that human nature and it gets crucified. The irony now is that we'll be like God, crucified. We can't be like God now without the cross, because that's how God is. And what that ultimately means is that when God gives us grace, and out of that grace arises charity, friendship with God, a greater and greater likeness, the more we penetrate participation into his life by virtue of the sacraments and prayer, self-knowledge, knowledge of God, the more penetration we have, the more we look like him. But that also means the more we look like the crucified, to the point where even his greatest friends, like Catherine of Siena or St. Francis of Assisi, even begin to bear the brand marks of Christ in their bodies. They look like God, now crucified. Because it moves from benevolence, that I have this great love for God. But now it's not just God, it's his body, his whole body, which means what can I do for God? He needs nothing from me. And yet we can, because of his body. So our charity for God, our love for him, our friendship with him, in some sense terminates in our good acts, in those acts of sacrifice for another. Take as just one example, St. Peter, who claimed to be able to die for Christ, but his friendship was all too natural at the time. Remember that he said, I will die with you. And our Lord, knowing what was in Peter, he says to Peter, you will die for me, will you? You won't even profess that you know me. Remember, what we're willing to suffer for someone is in proportion to our love for them. And yet, Peter would. When Peter had fallen and then was strengthened in his friendship by God with that grace that he received in the upper room of Pentecost, Peter was conformed to him, so conformed to him to look like God now crucified, that Peter himself died on a cross, upside down, perfect conformity to the one that was his friend, the one that he loved. And he did so not because Christ needed it, but because the church did. In other words, our love moves from just our relationship with God, my personal relationship with Jesus, to his mystical body, that I must give myself out of love for him, for all of those who are in his body, that they too might be brought into this friendship. And so one of the highest witnesses we have, one of the greatest realities of friendship with God that is manifested is, of course, the martyrs. For did not Christ say to us, greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friends? This he did for us, and this, of course, we must do for him and all of those that he has invited into his divine friendship. Next lesson, we're going to describe belief. We're going to speak about firmly believing. So come back tomorrow, and we'll enter into what it means to profess that I believe.